The hearing of the subcommittee will come to order, and I want to welcome our very distinguished witnesses and our very esteemed guests who are here, many of whom are members of Congress from Brazil. Thank you for making that trip, and I'll be introducing you a little later on, but I am very grateful for your physical presence. Since late 2022, Brazilians have been subject to grave human rights violations committed by Brazilian officials on a vast scale. Documented right violations in Brazil include the political abuse of legal procedures to persecute political opposition, including jailing opposition figures on spurious charges, violations of freedom of speech and media freedom, including persecution of journalists, the silencing of opposition media, banning individuals from social media, thinly veiled censorship laws claiming to fight disinformation, and many violations of rule of law and judicial malfeasance. The government of Brazil has pursued Brazilian journalists and political opponents in the United States of America as well. It has used Interpol, red notices, social intimidation, threats of legal action and extradition, and according to one credible victim of transnational repression, has sought to use the FBI as a carrier or conduit to its intimidation. I would point out that legislation that I've introduced on transnational repression will be soon marked up by the committee. Michael McCall, I'm the prime sponsor of it, has said it will be on our next markup, and that is designed to stop governments, including China and other dictatorships, from intimidating people here in the United States in such a callous way, which is what they do. Pardon me. In December of 2022, Mary O'Grady, who writes a weekly column on Latin America for the Wall Street Journal, noted that the crackdown is ordered not by the executive, by the judicial branch. Quote, a greater threat, as she points out, is the 11-member Supreme Court, which is overstepping its jurisdiction and flouting the rule of law for political reasons without consequences. When the highest court becomes an ally of ideological and corrupt politicians, democracy is in grave danger. She goes on, Brazil has arrived at such a moment. The court censored other political speech from business leaders, elected officials of Congress, members of Congress, and news and entertainment platforms on the right. This has been carried out with assistance from the Electoral Tribunal's Special Advisory to Combat Disinformation. It acts as a ministry of truth, so-called. In fact, the crackdown is largely in the name of one man, Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Alexander de Moraes. In late January of 2023, the New York Times reported, referring to Moraes, quote, this is from the New York Times, using a broad interpretation of the court's powers, he has pushed to investigate and prosecute, as well as to silence on social media, anyone he deems a menace to Brazil's institutions. He has jailed people without trial for posting threats on social media, helped sentence a sitting congressman to nearly 9 years in prison for threatening the court, ordered raids on businessmen with little evidence of wrongdoing, suspended an elected governor from his job, and unilaterally blocked dozens of accounts and thousands of posts on social media with virtually no transparency or room for appeal. And that's the New York Times article. Since January of 2023, the abuses have grown and spread in expanding waves of persecution. Yet almost all the major media have almost ignored this story. And that has got to change. That's what this hearing hopefully will be a pivot. And we will begin on this committee, and I have legislation that I'm working on right now that would be a Democracy Act, and I've written many of them in the past. The Belarus Democracy Act in 2004 is law of the land, and many others. This one would be focused on Brazilian human rights and democracy, or lack thereof. Well, although the Western media and most prominent human rights groups have said little, others have stepped in and gathered a vast amount of additional evidence about an expanding wave of grave human rights abuses in Brazil, social media bans, political persecutions, prosecutions, jailing opposition on spurious charges, thinly veiled censorship laws, again, claiming to fight disinformation. We'll hear from some of these people today as part of our distinguished panel. The testimony of Michael Shellenberger is all the more fascinating because long ago he was drawn to Lula. He interviewed Lula in 1994 and asked him whether his socialism would lead to censorship. He said emphatically, this is Lula now, no, the Brazilian people love freedom too much, as did he. Shellenberger is now a renowned investigative journalist. He documents the systematic, far-reaching efforts of the Supreme Court justice to ban and punish political opponents of the Lula government, to do so in secrecy, to further pursue anyone who reveals or discusses what he is doing, and the fear he has inspired. We'll also hear the harrowing personal testimony of Paulo Figueiredo. Paulo is a prominent Brazilian journalist living in Miami. He opposed riots, but also in many points opposed or questioned the government. The Brazilian government blocked him from all social media platforms, including YouTube and Twitter, froze his assets, and subjected him to exorbitant fees. Pursuing Paulo to Rumble, the government eventually forced the closure of Rumble in Brazil and moved on to additional measures of intimidation. Paulo will cite a long list of other journalists who have suffered similarly, and many of these he is in personal contact with. And I always believe the journalists are like the canary in the coal mine when it comes to human rights. When they speak out, we need to listen. They are the whistleblowers. So thank you, Paulo, for your bravery and your steadfastness on the right of free speech. Paulo and other Brazilians fighting for human rights have found their greatest ally, perhaps, in Elon Musk. On April 6th and 7th, in a series of tweets and retweets heard around the world, Musk, the owner of X, formerly Twitter, described the secretive, sweeping, and regime of censorship, the attempt to prevent him from even talking about the censorship orders and threats to the company that he was receiving. Musk announced that this, quote, and this is his quote, this aggressive censorship appears to violate the law, and that's Brazilian law he's talking about, and the will of the people of Brazil. Musk announced that he would defy the court's order and lifted all restrictions. He went on to say that X will publish everything demanded by @Alexandra and how those requests violate Brazilian law. The judge has brazenly and repeatedly betrayed the Constitution and the people of Brazil, he goes on to say in his tweet. Confirming everything Paulo and Michael Shellenberger have said about Brazil, Moraes added Musk to his fake news investigation and opened an inquiry on Musk for what he called an obstruction of justice. Free speech, media freedom, censorship, these are becoming some of the most important human rights abuses of our times. Because without freedom of expression, we are unable to defend against any other human rights abuse. In 2006, I have chaired well over 500 human rights hearings on human rights in my career as a member of Congress. But one of those, and one of the most important, was in 2006, and this is right up there as one of the most important ever. I chaired an historic hearing on the complicity of Yahoo, Microsoft, Cisco, and Google in China's regime of internet censorship and surveillance. Four of the top people from those companies are vice presidents. I swore them in right where you're sitting and asked them hard questions about how they were helping the Chinese Communist Party track down human rights defenders, journalists, and others. And they said, we're just following orders. If the Chinese secret police come and ask us for information, what do? They turn it all over, including personally identifiable information that leads to more arrests. And that's exactly what happened. Yahoo, there was a guy named Shi Tao who talked about how they were told you cannot talk about Tiananmen Square. He sent out a memo on that went to New York. He got 10 years in prison, and Yahoo were the ones who opened up the information that was used to prosecute him in a kangaroo court in the People's Republic of China. So free speech is important. And again, this reminds me of that hearing where we have Lula, who is a socialist, who is not abiding by the rule of law, is mirroring exactly what the Chinese Communist Party has done. In recent years, we've had wave after wave of revelations of our own government's activities in pursuing companies to censor, limit, manipulate, and control information. Today, many elected officials, as well as leading newspapers and media organizations, openly support the call for more censorship, We need more speech, not less. More speech. And, I was talking to Chris earlier from Rumble, and that was precisely his point. More speech. Let people speak out. That's what free speech is all about. We're going to hear today from star witnesses who have assembled a galaxy of evidence of widespread politically motivated censorship and persecution in Brazil. I will also be submitting questions to the Biden administration about its relationships and interactions with the government of Brazil on the issues we are raising in this hearing today. As I indicated earlier, I am working on legislation, a Brazil Freedom and Democracy Act, that will require the U.S. government to engage more vigorously with Brazil on the side of freedom and human rights. Mary O'Grady, again, from the Wall Street Journal, summed it up so well when she said, Brazil, the grim reality in Brazil is that democracy is dying in broad daylight. Again, I want to thank the many Brazilians who are here, who made the trip. I want to thank our distinguished witness, and I yield to my friend and colleague, the ranking member, Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to all who are participating here today or attending. With all due respect to everyone involved in this hearing, I would like to say at the outset that this is not the hearing on Brazil that I believe we should be having today. The hearing I believe we should be having is one focused on the 200th anniversary this year of the bilateral relationship between the United States and Brazil, the two largest democracies in the Western Hemisphere. The hearing I believe we should be having is one focused on the many areas of cooperation between our two countries, on labor and workers' rights, climate and protecting the Amazon, combating hunger, poverty and violence, and expanding sustainable and broad-based economic growth, stability, security, and peace throughout the hemisphere. Above all, we should be working to advance our critical partnership with Brazil in a spirit of mutual respect. Unfortunately, the framing of this hearing, which I believe presents a distorted view of Brazilian democracy and provides a platform to those seeking to undermine it, does the opposite of that. Rather than strengthening our relationship, a hearing like this serves only to damage and undermine it. Brazil is a strong and vibrant democracy with a robust civil society and media, a multitude of political parties representing a huge political spectrum, and an electoral system that is rightly considered to be one of the most secure and rapid in the world. Like all democracies, including right here in the United States, there are healthy debates to be had about aspects of the country's institutions. But I want to be clear, internal politics and debates on constitutional and legal issues should be decided by the Brazilian people, their elected representatives, and Brazil's judiciary. The United States Congress is not the forum for it. We can and should continue to find areas for cooperation and mutual advancement, but we should not and cannot act as if we somehow have a mandate to weigh in on the internal mechanisms of Brazil's institutions. Democracies are different, each informed by their own history. Brazil's 1988 Constitution was shaped by a military dictatorship that usurped power through a military coup and brutally ruled the country from 1964 to 1985. Many of the people who lived through these horrific years still remember state-led extrajudicial killings, disappearances, and torture. Brazil's democracy responded by providing courts with the mandate to protect its hard-won democracy and prevent authoritarianism from taking root again. What we will hear today from some witnesses is an attempt to undermine Brazil's judicial process. Former President Bolsonaro's conduct in office, his praise for the military dictatorship, his calls for violence against his political opponents, his refusal to acknowledge his 2022 election loss, his attempt to engineer a coup, and his incitement of the January 8th attacks triggered laws in place designed to serve as a check on executive power resulting from the coup in 1964. Brazilian law enforcement and judiciary have refused to stand by idly in response to the most serious threat to Brazil's democracy since the military dictatorship. They have responded robustly, according to their constitution and their legal system, which again have key differences with ours in the United States. Brazil, like France, Germany, and other Western European countries whose democratic credentials would likely not be questioned by anyone in this room, has a different conception of freedom of speech than we have here in the United States. Brazil's approach to freedom of speech, while broad, includes guardrails informed by this recent history. The title of today's hearing is Brazil, a Crisis of Democracy, Freedom, and Rule of Law. Mr. Chairman, respectfully, I would ask, where was the hearing about Brazilian democracy when we learned about then-President Bolsonaro's efforts to foment a military coup? Where was the hearing after supporters of former President Bolsonaro led a coordinated attempt to overthrow the country's democracy on January 8th, 2023? This brings us to January 8th and the parallels between January 6, 2021 and January 8, 2023. Put simply, the January 8th attack, conducted in the manner it was clearly inspired by the January 6th attack. I believe we need more investigation of the connections between the two events and the role that individuals in the United States may have played in the coup attempt, including far-right public figures who used their platforms to, at a minimum, express support for a coup. This is another essential question I would have liked to see reflected in the framing of this hearing. How precisely did 2020 U.S. election deniers and the January 6th attack here in the United States enable the attempt to reject the results of the 2022 election in Brazil and to attempt a coup on January 8th? And how can members of Congress in both countries work together to strengthen our democracies in the face of these threats? I have with me today a copy of the report issued by Brazil's Parliamentary Inquiry Commission on the January 8th attacks. It contains critical findings. Mr. Chairman, I am submitting excerpts of the report for the record. I am also entering a statement prepared by Representative Jim McGovern, the co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, into the record. As it happens, this year marks the 60th anniversary of the 1964 coup that led to Brazil's military dictatorship. Part of democracy means being honest about the instances in which we fall short of the ideals that we proclaim. The U.S. government's involvement in and support for the 1964 coup was such a moment in our history. In this hearing, let us be cognizant of the history between our countries. Let us approach our vital relationship with Brazil as a partnership of equals, not one in which the United States seeks to dictate events or interfere with Brazilian democracy. Let us learn from the consequences of past actions and remember that the role of the United States should not be to interfere in internal judicial proceedings, or worse, destabilize democratically elected leaders who disagree with aspects of United States policy, but rather to build durable alliances around the world, understanding that we will have differences even with close partners and allies. Brazil's 2022 elections were free and fair. The United States government, alongside the international community, recognized the results immediately. In response to the attempts to overturn the election results, Brazil's institutions prevailed. Democracy prevailed. The Brazilian people prevailed. This is the vision that I intend to defend in today's hearing and beyond. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I will introduce our very distinguished witnesses, but just make a couple of points. One, the Republicans were not in control of the House. The Democrats were in control of the House, so the hearings that you mentioned should have been had, could have been done by the Democrats. It was not done or contemplated, as far as I know. So I just think that, for the record, that needs to be known. And in terms of, I am a firm believer that friends don't let friends commit human rights abuses. we have an obligation, a moral obligation that's not so easily satisfied when we see human rights abuses that are occurring, whether they be underreported by certain aspects of the human rights community or not. They need to be exposed. And this violation of religious free speech is very profound. It is getting worse, and I think we have a moral obligation. And I'll just also one other thing. I was engaged in the effort to bring David Goldman's son, Sean Goldman, back from Brazil when Lula was the president before. We tried very hard to get hearings. We finally had one. I got a resolution passed on the floor of the House, and in complete violation of the Hague Convention on Parental Abduction, because they are signatories to it, Lulu and his government refused to abide by that international set of principles established by the United Nations. We're part of that Hague Convention, as is Brazil, and it took the threat of taking away GSP, Generalized Systems of Preferences, in order to get the Brazilian government to say, you better let this little boy leave and be joined with his father. So I learned the hard way. I went to Brazil twice during that ordeal, and again, Lulu was of no help. He was on the other side of that situation. And that is a human rights issue of the highest level. So now we're talking about free speech, and then we're talking about in terms of right now, it's being violated, I believe, with impunity, and we need to speak out. We need to speak with one voice, because friends don't let friends commit human rights abuses. I'd like to now introduce Chris Pavlovski, who is the founder and chief executive officer of Rumble. As a three-time successful entrepreneur, Mr. Pavlovski has founded Cosmic Development in 2011, a global IT business employing 150 employees with offices in Europe and North America. The business was ranked as the second best employer in Macedonia and has been the recipient of numerous awards. Mr. Pavlovski also sits on numerous boards, including Macedonia 2025, a not-for-profit focused on economic and educational development in that country. Michael Shellenberger is founder, president of Environmental Progress, and CBR chair of Politics, Censorship, and Free Speech at the University of Austin. He is also a leading investigative journalist who has broken major stories on crime and drug policy, homelessness, Amazon deforestation, rising climate resilience, growing eco-anxiety, the U.S. government's role in the fracking revolution, and climate change and California fires. He has testified to Congress at many hearings, including in recent years on AI and censorship, on big tech censorship, and on the censorship industrial complex, as he puts it. Paulo Figueiredo, I always have a little problem with that, is an investigative journalist. As a journalist, Paulo stands out as one of the most well-known figures in Brazilian journalism media. When he appeared on JP News Network, his show was an absolute leader in audience ratings for various television programs. On his social media account and YouTube channel, he has millions of subscribers seeking a perspective absent from the legacy media. He currently hosts his own show, which leads the audience ratings in its time slot on the internet. In 2022, the Supreme Court of Brazil blocked all of his social media accounts in Brazil, froze all of his financial assets, and canceled his passport without any formal communication or accusation. Fabio de La Silva is Associate Professor of International Studies and Wick Carey Professor of Brazilian Studies at the University of Oklahoma, and the affiliated fellow at Harvard Law School Center on the Legal Profession. In Brazil, he served in the Ministry of Justice and the Institute for Applied Economic Research, and consulted for UNDP, UNESCO, and International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. Fabio is the author of high-impact studies of law, lawyers, and democracy. He's frequently sought after by the media to comment on Brazilian affairs. Chris, the floor is yours.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Wild, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to come before you today to discuss the importance of protecting the freedoms of speech and expression. My name is Chris Pavlovski. I'm a native of Toronto, Canada, and the chairman and CEO of Rumble. When I founded Rumble in 2013, incumbent platforms had become beholden to large creators, brands, and large corporations. Rumble provided an alternative for small and independent creators to speak their minds, express their opinions, own their narrative, build communities, and maximize their earnings. Our company was founded on a mission to protect a free and open internet, as we believe everyone benefits when there is a diverse marketplace of ideas, opinions, and dialogues. In late 2020 and into 2021, we realized the power of our mission as millions of users followed creators to the emerging platform, with little to no marketing. Some of Rumble's largest creators, including former Congressman Devin Nunes, Dan Bongino, Glenn Greenwald, and former Democratic presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard also joined the platform during this time. As a result, Rumble saw its average monthly active users increase dramatically from 1.6 million in the third quarter of 2020 to 36 million in the third quarter of 2021. In other words, we saw an increase of 22.5 times the number of users in just one calendar year. In September of 2022, Rumble successfully went public, relocating our headquarters to the United States and trading on the NASDAQ under the ticker symbol RUM, R-U-M. We've expanded our video content into new verticals like sports, lifestyle, hip-hop, and video gaming. Beyond the video sharing platform, Rumble now offers the Rumble Advertising Center, Rumble Studio live streaming software, and the Rumble Cloud. Freedom of speech and freedom of expression are the cornerstones of a democratic society. I know that's not a foreign idea to the members on this subcommittee who have witnessed these rights used to protest tyrannical governments around the world and inequalities here in the United States. Freedom of expression is so important that not only is it the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, but it is also Article 19 in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Without these freedoms, we may have never learned the stories of Frederick Douglass during the abolition movement in the 1830s, or witnessed the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the women's rights movements of the 1970s, or the Arab Spring in the early 2010s. It is extremely troubling to me that in 2024, I have to come before the US Congress to testify that these fundamental rights are being threatened. For years, we saw platforms shadow ban ideas they did not agree with. It was subtle suppression of ideas and opinions that did not fit the norm as dictated by algorithms. Today, the censorship we see is much more overt. Governments are acting in ways we only imagine happening 50 to 60 years ago, openly asking platforms to censor and take down disfavored content. They are back in the business of thinking they know what's best, dictating and controlling conversations and stripping the human right to speak and share freely. These are not theoretical fears. These things are happening, and I know this personally as the CEO of a platform that receives demands from governments around the world. One of the first instances of government censorship we experienced did not come as a surprise, as it came from communist China. Communist governments often crack down on a variety of freedoms, including freedom of expression. However, we were surprised in 2022 when we received a request from the French government to block certain news sources. People can certainly question the trustworthiness of news sources, but it should not be any government's job to selectively eliminate access to information. Rather than comply with the French government's request, we simply disabled the access to the platform in France and challenged the legality of this demand. To be clear, Rumble has a strong set of content guidelines under our terms and conditions, but the content the French government was asking us to censor did not violate any of our terms. Instead, it was regarding Russian news outlets. Earlier this year, we received requests from the Brazilian government to remove certain creators from our platform. Again, the content did not violate our terms and conditions, but instead shared opinions that were unpopular in Brazil at the time. Rumble made a very tough decision not to comply with the government's request. As with France, we chose to disable access for our users in Brazil while we challenged the legality of the Supreme Court's demands. It does not stop there. Just last month, we received requests from New Zealand and Australia to censor politically unpopular content. Countries in every hemisphere, all of the members of the United Nations, are no longer upholding the human right to freedom of expression. This is getting out of control, and it should alarm everyone in this room. As this committee knows, the United States is involved in so many initiatives to protect democracy around the world, But when it comes to defending the freedom of speech and protecting American businesses who attempt to uphold this right in Brazil, the United States has been silent. It cannot remain so. It does not matter which platform hosts the content. Today it is Rumble, yesterday it was X, but tomorrow it could be the New York Times. The platform shouldn't matter. The universal right to freedom of speech and expression, the core of Western democracy, is at stake. America needs to step up and take a leading role. Rumble will never back down from our mission. We are the tip of the spear in this fight, and we relish that. We urge everyone, especially the US State Department, to join us. I'll close with one final thought. Every totalitarian regime that has crushed the rights of individuals has sought to control what people can say and hear. It's never the good guys doing the censoring. If the United States won't stand up for freedom of speech, who will? Thank you again for the opportunity to be with you today. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you so very much for your testimony. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Shellenberger.
Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Wild, thank you very much for inviting my testimony. Brazil has been a liberal democracy for over 30 years. During that period, there have been free and fair elections, people have been free to express their views, and it's notable to me that Brazil's own constitution specifically protects political freedom of speech. Quote, any and all censorship of a political, ideological, and artistic nature, reads Chapter 5, Article 220, Paragraph 2 of the Brazilian Constitution, is prohibited. Today, Brazil is no longer a liberal democracy. It is an illiberal one, where people, including former Workers' Party members and prominent legal scholars, say they fear speaking their minds, including about the illiberalism of their country, for fear of punishment. And for simply exposing this fact, I now find myself under criminal investigation by Brazil's federal police and attorney general. The evidence suggests that the federal Supreme Court, the STF, and the Superior Electoral Court, the TSE, which are under the heavy influence of a single justice named Alexandre de Moraes, are directly interfering in elections by demanding the deplatforming of independent journalists and politicians on every major social media platform. Jay Moraes is not simply demanding that social media platforms censor specific content by controversial journalists and politicians. He is demanding that all social media platforms ban them for life, and he often does so through secret hearings without the right of appeal. It is important to stress this point. One cannot be a politician or an independent journalist in the age of the internet if you cannot communicate on social media. As such, the censorship in Brazil is the worst I have seen in any Western democracy. Jay Moraes has acted unilaterally to invent whole new laws, therefore interfering not only with elections, but also taking over the role of Congress. My involvement began on April 3rd, 2024, when I published the Twitter Files Brazil. They show Supreme Court Justice Jay Moraes had illegally demanded that Twitter reveal private information about Twitter users who used hashtags he considered inappropriate and demanded the deplatforming of independent journalists and politicians. 3 days later, on April 6th, X Corporation, formerly Twitter, announced that a Brazilian court had forced it to, quote, block certain popular accounts in Brazil. 1 hour later, X's owner Elon Musk announced that X would defy the court's order and lift all restrictions. 1 day later, April 7th, Jay Moraes announced a criminal investigation into Musk for allegedly spreading disinformation, obstructing justice, and allowing people who Jay Moraes had banned from social media to freely express their views. Jay Moraes said he would fine X $20,000 per day for every banned person Musk allowed to speak. On April 15th, X's top attorney in Brazil resigned his post, fearing for his safety. On April 18th and April 19th, Brazil's federal police published 2 reports that suggested that I was under criminal investigation for publishing the Twitter Files Brazil. The reports claim that the people whom Jay Moraes had demanded be censored had gained limited access to communicate on X, particularly through X's Spaces, which allows for live conversation. This is yet more evidence that Jay Moraes is obsessed with silencing his enemies. It was not enough for X to have blocked their profiles within Brazil. Jay Moraes also does not want those individuals to be able to use their voices. The federal police reports that singled me out suggested that it was somehow suspicious that I only have one paid subscription on X, which is to Elon Musk. But there's nothing suspicious about this. I am paying Musk, not the other way around. And as the police report notes, Musk takes a percentage of the revenue of the people who subscribe to my content on X. I will note, in a moment of irony and some levity, that this police report reproduced the banner from my profile page on X, which reads, "Defund the Thought Police." I took a small amount of pleasure in knowing that the Thought Police were reproducing a slogan against their mission. 3 days later, Brazil's Attorney General, Jorge Messias, urged the Supreme Court to pursue criminal prosecution, unquote, and investigation to, quote, identify and punish the possible culprits. His report named me specifically. At no point did the Attorney General suggest that either I or my co-authors, Eli Vieira and David Agape, lied or presented inaccurate information. Rather, the Attorney General's 6-page memo released publicly claims that I released, quote, excerpts of content from confidential judicial decisions in an attempt to destabilize the democratic state. But both accusations are also untrue. None of the Twitter files Brazil contained any confidential judicial decisions. The Twitter files Brazil's were strictly emails between Twitter staff. There's not a single instance where we published confidential judicial decisions. But even if we had, the Brazilian Constitution reads, quote, the law may only restrict the publicity of procedural acts when the defense of privacy or social interests so require, Article 5. And in this case, it was imperative that we publish the Twitter files precisely to protect the Brazilian public's right to privacy, freedom of speech, and democracy. What's more, this attack on me is highly selective. Brazilian news media have reported on confidential judicial decisions for years and not been subjected to such outrageous criminal investigation as the one I am under. Finally, there is no law in Brazil attempting to, quote, attempting to prohibit, quote, the destabilization of the democratic state through nonviolent means. The law only prohibits violent attacks on democracy. As such, the Attorney General abuses his power and acts as a lawmaker, usurping Brazil's Congress. And just imagine for a moment if Brazil criminalized something as vague as destabilizing the democratic state. Such a law would allow President Lula to lock up nonviolent protesters, journalists, and his political rivals. While in Brazil, I interviewed dozens of Brazilians, including professors, journalists, and respected lawyers. The vast majority told me they were shocked by what is happening and that they are too afraid to speak their minds about it publicly. We are at a very dangerous moment. Brazil's democracy is at risk despite its strong constitutional protections. Thank you for my testimony. Thank you for asking for my testimony.
Thank you so very much. I'd like to now ask Paulo if he would make his presentation.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wild, and distinguished members of the House, my name is Paulo Figueiredo, and I am the living, breathing proof of human rights violations in Brazil. For doing the work of a good journalist, I am censored in all social media. I have my assets frozen and my Brazilian passport canceled, all without due process. I come from a family with a long legacy of fighting tyranny. My great-grandfather, General Euclides Figueiredo, led a revolution against Brazil's most brutal dictator, Getúlio Vargas. For that, he spent years in a dungeon. His son, my grandfather, João Figueiredo, became Brazil's 30th president in 1979, tasked with ending the 15-year-long military regime. As president, he granted amnesty, held free elections, allowed multiple political parties, and by the end of his term, peacefully handed power back to civilians, restoring full democracy in Brazil. I never imagined this legacy of fighting for individual freedoms would span generations and fall upon me as well. Until the end of 2022, year of Brazil's latest presidential election, I was a political commentator on JP News, a TV network often compared to US Fox News. The primetime show I was in had been voted the best in the country and had more viewers than the next two networks combined, including the local CNN. I had over 5 million followers across all social media with higher engagement than virtually any other journalist in Brazil. By any account, I was one of the most influential journalists in the country, until I started being targeted by a series of decisions from the highest court in the land. In December 2022, I had all my social media accounts blocked for Brazilians. Later, I learned that the order would extend to freezing my financial assets, suspending the confidentiality of my financial transactions, threatening exorbitant fines every time I said something that displeased Justice Alexandre de Moraes, and even canceling my Brazilian passport. I disappeared from my entire audience. This is the modern equivalent of being sent to a dungeon, as was my great-grandfather. In January 2024, following Lula's inauguration and the January 8th riots, Brazil's Department of Justice opened a case against JP News, accusing the channel of fomenting the revolt. Demonetized by YouTube, faced with new criminal case and threat of losing its public concession, JP News gave in and laid off all its conservative commentators and adopted a more Moraes-friendly editorial stance. I was unemployed, with all my assets frozen and my work tools blocked. Rumble and locals promised to always stand for freedom of expression, so I joined, quickly becoming one of the biggest content creators on both, with 120,000 subscribers on Rumble and nearly 60,000 subscribers and 2,000 paid subscribers on locals. However, in December 2023, pressured by absurd orders issued by Moraes, with me being one of the main targets, I believe, both platforms closed access to all Brazilians. The financial loss has been unbearable. On February 8, 2024, Brazilian newspapers reported a new offensive against me. I was apparently being investigated for accurately reporting on primetime TV the behind-the-scenes meetings of the Brazilian Army's High Command in December 2022. In this investigation, a new measure was issued prohibiting me from having contact with former President Bolsonaro and any other person investigated, a clear intimidation tactic that hinders my journalist activities. There's one single name behind every one of these decisions. That's Alexandre de Moraes. Remember this name. He's the de facto dictator of Brazil. He's a Supreme Court justice, the head of the Superior Electoral Court, known as TSC, and the man in charge of the infamous fake news probe, which began in 2019 and is still open. An alarming caveat. Through all this, my work was being carried out from my studio in Florida, where I have been residing since 2016. I have therefore been under the jurisdiction of this country the entire time, and consequently protected by the rights guaranteed in the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America. American companies have been obeying illegal orders directly from Brazilian judges without following international procedures and sharing data of individuals under American jurisdiction. This Congress should address this issue, as it is not only violates our constitutional rights, but also exposes an intelligence risk and potentially violates the FCPA. By no means I was the only journalist affected. On the same day, award-winning journalists and bestseller authors Rodrigo Constantino, present here in this hearing, and Guilherme Fiuza were targets of nearly identical copy and paste decisions. Other journalists, such as Alan dos Santos, also present here today, had faced even harsher measures, including arrest orders. Libertarian podcaster Monarch, known as the Brazilian Joe Rogan, suffered a similar fate. They're both exiled in the US. There are numbers of other examples, including comedians or even a judge, Ludmila Grillo, here in the audience, or congressmen like Nicolas Ferreira and Gustavo Gayer, also present here, Marcel Van Hatten, Carlos Jordi, Alexandre Ramagem, Carla Zambelli, many other members of Congress, and even Senator Marcos Duval, who had their social media blocked, offices raided, or passports taken by Moraes. Congressman Daniel Silveira is currently serving 9 years in prison for recording a video harshly criticizing Moraes. Former Congressman Dalton Dallagnol, the former prosecutor who got Lula da Silva convicted for corruption, also here, lost his seat by order of Moraes' court. A survey showed that 70% of Brazilian members of Congress believe the Supreme Court invades their powers. Some of 2/3 of Brazilians believe the country lives under a judicial dictatorship. Demonstrations with hundreds of thousands of people are mostly against Moraes. The Brazilian people and Congress know Moraes is out of control, but are paralyzed with fear. Many ask how one justice can do all these things, given that Brazil has laws defending freedom of expression. In fact, Alexandre de Moraes does not have this power by law, and his actions flagrantly violate the Brazilian Constitution, specifically Article 5, items 4, 9, and Article 220, as well as international laws, which Brazil is a signatory, such as Article 13, paragraph 1 and 2, and the American Convention of Human Rights, and Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These censorship and persecution actions occur within illegal process, such as the mentioned fake news probe, which is now investigating even Elon Musk, where Moraes acts as the alleged victim, investigator, prosecutor, and judge without the right to appeal. He also acts through his seat in TSC, which granted itself exceptional powers during the 2022 elections that persist to these days. These acts occurred in a veiled way, with cases running under legal secrecy and lawyers not having full access to the case files. My case is iconic in that sense. For about a year and a half, I have been suffering the described penalties without being formally notified or informed of any decisions or procedures against me, making me unable to defend myself. I only accessed the decisions against me when the Judiciary Committee of this House subpoenaed acts requesting and publicizing Moraes' decision. The content, which generally lacks legal basis and specifics on violated laws, shocked me, the world, and the Brazilian people. This secrecy occurs because Brazil has no law criminalizing fake news, whatever that is. For these reasons, Moraes currently faces 100 complaints in the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. Regrettably, they have been sitting on these cases. The United States may have a broad role in this sad story as well. Some could even say that the US government and NGOs acted directly in strengthening Brazil's censorship apparatus. First, the US government may have assisted the Brazilian TSC in developing strategies to quote-unquote combat disinformation and strengthen censorship practice, with FBI agents and US Department of Justice officials participating in TSC council meetings, with the participation as well of the Brazilian intelligence agency, ABIN. These meetings mark the beginning of TSC's authoritarian escalation. The tactics outlined in the recent Censorship Industrial Complex report by this House Committee on the Judiciary, which details how the Biden administration coerced big tech companies to censor Americans, closely resemble the modus operandi in Brazil. However, while the Biden administration acted mostly informally, Moraes issued judicial orders throughout Brazil's highest court, threatening fines or complete disconnection from Brazil if big tech challenged them, as happened to Telegram in March 2022. American NGOs, including George Soros' Open Society and the Ford Foundation and the Woke Foundation, funded initiatives that worked closely with Moraes. The Atlantic Council, also funded by Soros, supplied reports and the theoretical foundation crucial to his fake news probe. But perhaps the most frightening influence was a systematic campaign that used all the soft power of American foreign policy as a quote-unquote discreet campaign to defend Brazilian elections, according to a 2023 Financial Times article. This involved covert actions by high-ranking US officials, such as the CIA director, the Secretary of Defense, and Biden's national security advisor, who threatened public officials, military leaders, and Brazilian politicians with sanctions to ensure Moraes was not challenged. It's puzzling why the US, historically a promoter of freedom and democracy, would use its top officials to support censorship and aid in the ascent of a president aligned with China, Russia, Hamas, Cuba, Venezuela, drug cartels, and opposed to American interests globally, even undermining the dollar as the world's reserve currency. CIA Director William Burns and other Biden administration key agents continue to meet with officials from the Lula da Silva government and TSC in Brazil, focusing on quote-unquote combating disinformation, which we know now is a code word for censorship of unpleasant speech. Additionally, a Brazilian congressional delegation supportive of Lula da Silva regime, including a congresswoman from the Communist Party, visited Washington, D.C. last week to meet with members of the Democratic Party and OAS representatives. Mr. Chairman, you are well aware of the immense challenges you had to overcome in order for this hearing to happen. Why? In Brazil, ultimately, it will be up to the Brazilian people to solve their own problems. But it's important that the United States of America once again become a force for freedom and no longer for censorship. The United States Congress has enormous powers in this direction, and I urge you to use them. First, ensure that Moraes Lula regime stops operating in the shadow. As the Bible says in John 8:32, then you'll know the truth, and truth shall set you free. Brazil needs to be the subject of more frequent hearings, and Congress must continue to use its powers to bring light to the facts. Congressmen, visit Brazil. I speak on behalf of the Brazilian congressmen here that you are welcome in our parliament, and your presence will bring greater visibility to what has been happening. Second, exercise oversight power against executive branch policies that harm not only freedoms in Brazil, but also U.S. global interests, pushing my country towards nations hostile to America, such as China. Third, withhold funds and resources, not only those destined for Brazil, but also for international organizations, such as the OAS, that are shirking their roles. The American taxpayer should not finance the oppression of my people. Finally, produce legislation imposing harsh sanctions on Brazilian government and officials who violate fundamental rights and freedoms. With this help, I guarantee that my country's institution will react and return our freedoms. This is what I beg of you on behalf of millions of Brazilians. God bless America, God bless Brazil.
Paulo, thank you very much for your testimony and for your recommendations. I'd like to now recognize Fabio.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wild, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this invitation and the honor to testify before you. Thoughts and prayers to the southern Brazilians who are going through a massive flood there. You all have my solidarity. On January 8, 2023, thousands invaded and vandalized the headquarters of 3 government branches in Brazil. This didn't happen out of nowhere. It was the result of a long process by which politicians, media influencers, and others, relying heavily on social media platforms, worked to discredit Brazilian institutions and spread 2 big lies. One, that the Brazilian elections had been defrauded and Lula da Silva, inaugurated a few days before, was illegitimate. Another, that given tensions in society and between government branches, the military had constitutional authority to take over. This was not the first violent action of Brazilian political factions unwilling to accept the results of the 2022 elections. In December, a few weeks after the votes had been counted and Lula was declared president, riots took place in the country, which included an attempt to bomb the Brasilia airport on Christmas Eve. The Supreme Court has been a special target of these extremists since 2020, when it ruled that the COVID policies that former President Bolsonaro planned to adopt were unconstitutional. "I've had enough," shouted Bolsonaro. He actually shouted, "Acabou, porra," which, in respect to the subcommittee, I'm not going to translate. Thereafter, Bolsonaro stood up against judges and even said in rallies that he was no longer going to respect court decisions. Others joined this call to confront justices on the streets and on social media. One of their mantras has been that the people are supreme. And in my written testimony, I provide with some pictures of demonstrations where this slogan features prominently. In this vision, courts must bow to what the people want. This is anything but a rule of law system, Mr. Chairman. It's actually a textbook definition of rule of man. As for the judiciary, it had to defend itself almost on its own. The chief federal prosecutor, appointed by Bolsonaro and with the authority to investigate high officials, was refusing to do his job, as demonstrated in studies. Congress, under new leadership, was becoming ever more complacent with Brazil's authoritarian leader. One of the few resources available to justice was to initiate investigations themselves, which in 2019, interpreting Article 43 of the court's bylaw, they understood they had the power to do. Some of these investigations are still underway, and they have produced substantial evidence that there was a plan to stage a coup, including through depositions by the former Bolsonaro's aide-de-camp, Mauro Cid, and the former Air Force commander, Carlos Batista Jr. The issues discussed in this hearing stem from this painful and complex context. Some question the decisions made by the Brazilian judiciary in those investigations, as well as in its capacity to oversee elections. They do so based on conceptions of freedom of speech that misrepresent Brazilian law and private files released by different sources. In my written testimony, I provide the subcommittee with a more detailed explanation of Brazilian law and why I see claims that Brazilians are living under a censorship regime controlled by a single Supreme Court justice, Mr. Alexandre de Moraes, as nonsense. I demonstrate, for instance, that Brazilian law fully allows judges to order the removal of social media posts and the suspension of accounts when those violate others' individual rights or the public interest. I also highlight that the authority of the Supreme Court to initiate investigations of online crimes against itself and against its members was recognized even by Bolsonaro's Solicitor General, Mr. André Mendonça, who currently sits on the court appointed by Bolsonaro. But in these initial and oral remarks, I want to make sure that we don't get lost among the trees and miss the forest. Is there a crisis in Brazilian democracy and rule of law? If there is, it's not because judges are trying to do their job, imperfect as they might be, as all other human beings. It's because we got very close to a point where judges would have become insignificant, subjugated by mobs unwilling to play by the rules of the game. And this, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wild, is how democracy dies. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask a few opening questions, and then I might do some follow-up after my colleagues have asked their questions. Again, Mr. Shellenberger, you make a very, very cogent case for how you actually thought Lula was a believer in free speech, and then you have now been disabused by that belief on the record, by the record, including against yourself. You point out that the law governing free speech is very robust, but it's not being followed. My colleague, Ms. Wild, mentioned that they have a different law. Well, how much different is it really from the universally recognized right to freedom of expression articulated by the UN and, of course, enshrined in our U.S. Bill of Rights? I am very concerned that we say they have a different definition becomes an excuse for allowing violations of fundamental free speech. In your backgrounder, and as well as in your testimony, you point out the sweeping, Mr. Fabio, sweeping restrictions on freedom of speech as severe as the ones that have been placed in Cuba since the early 1960s. And just for the record, I have raised human rights issues vis-a-vis Cuba my entire 44 years as a member of Congress. And I have had people push back and tell me how that's not true. I have tried to go to Cuba for about 30 years. I've been denied when Fidel Castro was still the dictator. I wanted to visit with the political prisoners. I had hearings on it here in this room and was told, you cannot come in. Even now, I've tried to go to Cuba, which is the paradise of human rights recognition, according to some. I remember we had one clergyman at one of my hearings tell me that his favorite scripture is Matthew 25, where our Lord said, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was in prison, did you visit me? So I had a long list of political prisoners, Oscar Bichette, many others, an Afro-Cuban who is an amazing, amazing leader that I had tried to visit with and was told, there's no way you're even going to get into Cuba. So I asked this Reverend Walker, who sat right where you're sitting, Michael, you say you visited all these prisoners. Name one political prisoner. He couldn't name a single one, because he had not. He was shilling for the Cuban dictatorship, as do so many other people in this town. And to me, that is an outrage, especially since you named the human rights abuse, including human trafficking, child sex trafficking, and all the others. And I wrote the laws on combating human trafficking in this country, as well as around the world. And the idea that we don't speak out against a friend because they are a friend on human rights. I was happy when George W. Bush put Israel and South Korea on the target list for bad actors on human trafficking, because again, friends don't let friends commit human rights abuses. But getting back to, Michael, your comments, could you elaborate, if you will, on this pivot towards crushing free speech of people with whom the Lula government and the Supreme Court justice disagrees?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yes, so I had an opportunity to interview the current president of Brazil in 1994. I asked him directly if he intended in his version of socialism for Brazil to engage in the kind of censorship and totalitarianism that we see in Cuba. And he was very adamant that he was not going to do that. And my interview with him, by the way, was not the only time that he had said that he would not pursue that level of censorship. Contrast that to his behavior since taking office. Last year, shortly after taking office, Lula created two agencies, the National Prosecutor's Office for the Defense of Democracy, under the supervision of the Attorney General, and it had this Orwellian named Department for the Promotion of Freedom of Expression with extraordinary censorship powers. I would also note that in all 50 instances where this Office for the Defense of Democracy demanded censorship in the first two-thirds of 2023, according to Revista Oeste last December, and it's a quote, all related to unfavorable information or criticism of the government, the members of the government who had called former President Dilma Rousseff's impeachment a coup, for example, never underwent any investigation. So the idea that there is somehow some effort to neutrally apply anti-misinformation or anti-disinformation laws is disabused by this particular case. We see so many of the things that they're doing, fake fact-checking websites that create predicates for censorship. We see in October 2022, before the second round of presidential elections, Lula's lawyer created a report claiming that supporters of Lula's opponent had created a disinformation ecosystem, leading the TSE to indict and censor 55 prominent individuals. That we also know that they created something called the Núcleo de Inteligência, a secret police force within the TSE to engage in creating predicates for censorship. So this is beyond anything that I had seen around the world, and we saw some very scary stuff in the United States. This is an extreme form of censorship that is, in my view, approaching what they do in Cuba.
Paulo, if I could ask you, has anyone raised complaints with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights or the rapporteur on freedom of expression of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights?
Yes, hundreds. I'd say 100 people. There are at least one here. I did at least two, actually, three people here that did file complaints. I did one myself. I'm filing a new one next week. My attorney is also here present. And unfortunately, they have been sitting on these cases, and it's a very sad thing to say. Their latest report says nothing about the violations and that are ongoing in Brazil. I mean, you could approach it through different ways, saying that some of these violations are not consensual. I think that's a proper way to describe it. But you need to mention it. They forgot to mention everything. And the problem is that they're mostly funded by U.S. So the U.S. is funding an institution that it's clearly not doing its job, and it's not the first time. They haven't been doing their job in a long, long time, or doing a poor job like they did in Peru, or I can stay here and talk about other countries as well. But the OAS is, and many of the people that are on the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights are connected to the Brazilian Supreme Court justice. At least one key figure is connected to Gilmar Mendes, which is another important figure from the Brazilian Supreme Court that supports most of Moraes' actions. So it's a sad thing.
Let me ask you with regards to a study by the Committee to Protect Journalists, an independent nonprofit organization that advocates for press freedom worldwide, as we all know. Brazil ranks 10th in the list of countries where murderers of journalists are most likely to escape punishment. It came out in a report just recently released, February 29th. Matter of fact, the headline was, Haiti joins list of countries where killers of journalists most likely to go unpunished. Can any of you share any light on that very, very disturbing acknowledgement by the committee?
I think you have a thing or two to say about that as well, right? It's on your report.
Can I?
Yeah.
So one piece of information that I bring in my testimony is the fact that Reporters Without Borders has recently released their latest ranking on the global press freedom, where Brazil moved up 20 positions from 2022 to 2023. That is to say, after Bolsonaro left
But
power.
from what to what? What are they now?
Say again?
What's their current number?
Current number is, I think, 62. I can check.
Oh, and
84. 62 is the US, but they are in the same tier.
right, and if I can, Mr. Chairman, add that this organization is also funded by George Soros, also funded by the Oak Foundation and the Ford Foundation.
the Committee to
it's a
Protect
circle.
Journalists-
It's a circle. They support their own narrative and they fund their own narrative.
And the Committee to Protect Journalists is independent.
It
And
is.
they have now ranked them as number 10.
It's hard to say who funds who, right? But it's
Number 10 isn't very good, believe me. I do have other questions, which I'll come back to, but I yield to Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to note and object to the anti-Semitic trope against Mr. Soros that was just uttered. But moving on, let me turn to you, Mr. De Silva. No, I know I got that wrong.
Figueiredo and Decisive are going to be hard for that.
Yeah,
Silva's easier.
I should have spent last night studying the pronunciations rather than my.
Well,
my
it's
notes.
Fee Gay, and I know you're a very big LGBT supporter. So Fee Gay Redo.
I am, in fact,
I know.
a big supporter
I
of
know.
LGBTQ
Yes.
rights. Thank you very much for noting that. So, Mr. Disa E. Silva, thank you. I want to talk about the attempts to overturn the 2022 election. In depositions to the Brazilian Federal Police, the former commanders of the Brazilian Army and Air Force asserted that then-President Bolsonaro sought but failed to gain their support for a draft decree to overturn his 2022 election defeat. And that draft decree would have proclaimed the election illegitimate, declared a state of siege, deployed the armed services to ensure the quote, necessary restoration of the democratic rule of law in Brazil. In your assessment, how high was the risk of the coup succeeding had then President Bolsonaro managed to gain the support of these branches of the armed forces?
Thank you, Congresswoman. It was very high. I believe when you draft a decree outlining what's going to happen once the military take over, which in some versions of this drafting even included the arrest of Justice Moraes, I think you're trying to anticipate what you're going to do when push comes to shove. And I want to say that a draft of this decree had been encountered with the former justice minister in the Bolsonaro cabinet, and another draft had been encountered in Bolsonaro's office itself, in his party, when the police conducted a search and seizure there. So it has corroborated by these testimonies the fact that they have been discussing these drafts.
And how long a period was that the draft decree was under drafting?
I'll have to check, but I think it's between the end of the first round of the elections until January.
Okay, and the election, am I right, was in October?
October, yeah,
Okay.
first round.
And so the draft decree wasn't fully prepared until January?
It was in the making.
Okay, and you heard the chairman's comments in
You asked me about the risk.
Wait, let me get to,
Okay.
let me just finish what I was going to say. You heard the chairman's comments in response to my opening remarks that Democrats were in the majority, Democrats here in Congress, and we could have done a hearing at that time. However, by the time this decree actually came about in January, as you said, I believe it's a matter of record that Republicans were actually in control on in January of 2023. So by the time we knew of this decree, Republicans were in control. I mean, that's not a question, it's just a statement, sir. Go ahead with what you were just going to respond to. How high was the risk of the coup succeeding?
Yes, and even the fact that a couple of military officers backed off, to me, it's not an indication that there wasn't support from the military for this to happen. I mean, they were involved in conversations, they attended meetings, I think it was a last-minute decision, making some calculations that this wasn't going to work. And one of the reasons why I think they thought that this wasn't going to work is because there wasn't international support for this kind of solution, especially from the United States government. And so I think you played an important role in securing democracy in Brazil by sending those signals.
But assuming that the armed services or the armed forces had not rejected his attempts, do you believe that the coup would have succeeded?
The circuit would have been closed, right? All the pieces that were needed would have been put together.
Okay. And what do you see? You made. Thank you for the kind remarks about the United States' role, but can you tell us what some of the primary factors were that ultimately prevented a democratic rupture from taking place?
I believe lack of international support, the fact that Lula da Silva is a politician that has high electoral density, so had lots of votes in the country and has great support from the majority of the Brazilian people. Had been somebody weaker, had somebody weaker than Lula been in that position, I think that person could have been run over.
Thank you. And what do you see today as the greatest threat to Brazil's democracy?
Primarily the persistence of this thinking that the military has a role to play in civilian government, which is one of the components of this whole plot. I mean, the idea was to create chaos and enable an intervention of the military in civilian politics based on this interpretation, very sketchy interpretation of Article 142 of our Constitution. But that, is something that continues to gravitate in Brazilian media sectors and political sectors. The Supreme Court has just rejected unanimously, by the way, this interpretation of Article 142, including with votes from those justices that were appointed by Bolsonaro. But this was a very key aspect of this process, and it speaks to the history of the country, which had a military dictatorship from 64 to 85.
Well, actually, thank you for bringing that up. Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but let me just ask you, did President Bolsonaro ever refer to military generals as my generals?
Yes. Yes, and there was even this video from a ministerial meeting that was also apprehended in this investigation that you make a reference to, where he refers to the fact that the Superior Electoral Court invited the military to oversee the electoral process. And he says, they made a mistake here because I am the commander, the chief supreme commander of the military, as if they were in his hands.
Madam Ranking Member, can I add something to that?
I'll get to you in a little bit. I want to just, actually, I have numerous other areas of questioning, Mr. Chairman, but I'd like to give other people an opportunity to ask some questions, and I'll come back.
Chair recognizes the distinguished gentlelady from Florida, chairwoman of the Western Hemisphere Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the invitation. And to the witnesses, thank you for being here and enduring with us. Unfortunately, while I was doing my research, I just came to the conclusion that now Brazil not only has a convicted felon for political corruption as president, Ignacio Lula da Silva, but now has a totalitarian operator as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court called Alexandre de Moraes. Wow. Thank you. I mean, there's nothing to celebrate. Poor Brazilians, they deserve a lot better. The most important country,
saying it, finally.
The most important country in the, economically speaking, or the largest economy in the Western Hemisphere, South America, I should say, to be more precise, deserves better. So, having said this, Elon Musk, the owner of Twitter, has become a target to the highest court because he shoots back. And that's the way you do it in a democracy. Really, we do not know if the Supreme Justice, Mr. de Moraes, is a socialist, or he's a useful fool, or he's a useful idiot for the socialists. But we do know that he is curtailing the most fundamental right that any democracy, including the Brazilians, have, which is free speech. And I really do not understand why. So that's why. Thank you very much, Mr. Shellenberger, for being here with us. And I do want you to explain to us, why do you think that Elon Musk and Twitter is in the crosshairs of this gentleman?
I think the short answer is that X and Mr. Musk just grew fed up with all the illegitimate, unconstitutional, and illegal requests for censorship. It's such a radical demand. In one case, we know that Guimarães was demanding that X deplatform a sitting member of Congress for content that he had posted on different social media platforms. This is completely absurd and outrageous. All of the claims, all of the major claims that the Brazilian government has made against Musk and including against me are disinformation themselves, including the idea that somehow this is a money play by Musk. The first thing that he said was, we're probably going to lose all of our financial business there and we may go bankrupt. Well, a few days later, the Brazilian government halted all advertising on X. You know, in fact, when I was in Brazil, I was still seeing Brazilian
So for what you're
government
telling me, I understand that then the president of the country and the chief justice are in cahoots. Is that what you're telling me?
That's what appears to be the case.
Do we have any proof of that?
Well, we do know that, yes, we saw media reports while this controversy was going on that Guimarães had been meeting with Lula and his advisors and coordinating some sort of a response.
But Guimarães was there before Lula was elected once again.
Yes.
So do you know if they had a previous relationship as friends in previous governments? I mean, what is known about his motives? Who does he work for?
Well, the latter question is a very interesting question, but we definitely know that they reconciled their relationship once Lula was elected president and came to power.
Reconciled, why? They had some arguments before.
Disagreement, yes. And that reconciled, and and then we saw in response to Elon Musk's standing up for free speech in Brazil, we saw Guimarães go to Lula and spend time with Lula and his advisors, making the case that they needed to, continue to fight for more censorship.
And why do you think that Twitter in particular has caused such an irritation?
I just think it's because Musk has got enough resources to be able to stand up to the Brazilian government. It's not easy and I don't think other platform CEOs besides Rumble and X have shown the courage. I mean, I think we're not naming the names here, but Google, Meta, Facebook, Instagram, these platforms are allowing the censorship to continue.
And I commend Elon Musk for doing that. Very good. That's exactly what he needs to do, not only in Brazil, but he needs to create the Brazilian model as an example that someone that has... He needs to create an example, not only for Brazil, but for the United States and for the rest of the hemisphere, that you do not mess with free speech. Across the board, it does not matter what you're saying, you have the right to say it as long as it does not bring violence, period. So there are two facts here that I think could shed some light on who Mr. Guimarães is, and these are facts. Number one, he gave the order to take down a post that said that Lula da Silva supports Daniel Ortega, the dictator of Nicaragua. Well, yes, it's true. So why can the Brazilians not know that? So Mr. Guimarães ordered to bring it down. Number two, he gave 1 hour to the company, to Twitter, to take down posts by conservative politicians, or they would be fined $30,000. So 1 hour, what about if you read the email 30 minutes into it? So you only had 30 minutes to take it down, or be fined $30,000. And those two politicians are here, Carla Zambelli and Marcel Van Hatten. Is that true?
Yes.
If I can step in here, we at Rumble have also received these requests, multiple, 9 in total. Our decision was to immediately leave Brazil upon these requests. and no longer do business in Brazil based on protecting human rights of free speech. These requests...
That's exactly what they want you to do, leave, which is what Musk is not doing, staying.
I would say that actually the best move is for all of us is to protest and turn off the platforms and not comply with their orders. Rumble did not comply with Moraes' orders. And at this point right now, the other platforms are still in compliance with the orders. Those accounts are banned on those other platforms. On Rumble, we did not ban those accounts. We left the country under the principle of free expression and protecting the human right of free expression. So I believe the best course of action is to all in protest shut off in Brazil and let the entire nation know that this is unacceptable, so that everyone in that country can then protest in their government to push back against this type of behavior.
But does the average Brazilian have any type of recourse to fight this back? I would say they don't, because they're working. And they're busy, and they're trying to make a living. So so my next question is, what can we do from this platform, to all of you, what can we do from this platform to protect the average Brazilian to read on Twitter, on any social media platform, whatever they want to, which is their right? What can we do as members of Congress? Either one.
Well, at the end of my remarks, I offer 4 suggestions. The first one is keep doing what you guys are doing here and then on Committee on the Judiciary, which is shed light to the issues in Brazil. I can say here what people can't in Brazil, and that's why they target me so hardly. The second thing, you're all welcome, I mean it, to visit Brazil. The mere fact that you go to Brazil and you talk in our house, and I speak on behalf of the Brazilian members of Congress, that we will hold hearings with you if you come to our country, and that itself will shed light. Light is important. I quoted the Bible verse, John 8:32, that you shall know the truth, and truth shall set you free. Right. The second is that you have immense power in oversight the executive branch, and the Biden administration has been a force for censorship. They enabled Moraes, and they have been enabling Moraes since the beginning. Not only them, but deep state agents as well, have FBI agents meeting TSC technicians.
But has the Biden administration picked up the phone and reached out to the Chief Justice and explained their disgust for what is happening?
I think they support what's happening.
They support what's happened.
They did. They actually sent the CIA director. They sent Jake Sullivan as well. They sent the Pentagon chiefs to Brazil in order to threaten Brazilian public officials, military leaders, to not challenge Moraes. That's what he's referring when he says, "Well, a coup didn't happen." It's not, no one ever thought of a coup. It's a complete lie. A coup was
Biden administration is interfering.
They openly interfered. There's a piece of the Financial Times, 2023 piece of the Financial Times, called the discreet campaign of the United States to defend Brazil's election. Defend Brazil's election meant that we couldn't challenge the serious concerns that we have about our electoral system. I mean, 82% of Brazilians, of the President Bolsonaro's voters, don't believe in the system. What, they should all be silenced? I should ask him. Because 82% of the electorate of Bolsonaro, 37% of the country should be silenced because they have concerns about a public service, because the Supreme Court decided that we cannot criticize an electoral system. These are public officials. The United States has no business
in interfering in elections in any other country.
Well,
we have enough problems with ours.
They've done in Brazil.
Thank you very much for that information, and I'm sure that Chairman Smith, we will take some action. Thank you for your info. Thanks to you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kamalager Dove.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I am so glad to join this hearing as the co-chair of the Brazilian caucus. You know, strengthening democracy should be a top priority of the U.S.-Brazil relationship, which is very long, especially given our country's shared experience with horrific attacks on our democratic institutions that were stoked by defeated, thin-skinned presidents seeking to reject the peaceful transition of power. In the United States, insurrectionists stormed this very Capitol on January 6th in an attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 elections by force, killing people, including members of law enforcement. 2 years later, Jair Bolsonaro and his far-right supporters took inspiration from Trump's election denial playbook and sought to orchestrate a military takeover, busing in protesters to storm all three branches of Brazil's government on January 8th. These attacks and the disinformation and conspiracy theories that enabled them represent the very real threats to democracy that we should be discussing. I did visit Brazil. I just came back from Brazil. I was actually there when videotape was revealed and shared of then President Bolsonaro hiding out in the Hungarian embassy. So I just returned, my time. I just returned from leading a delegation of Congressional Black Caucus members to Brazil to learn about our shared histories of racial discrimination. And if we want to talk about strengthening democracy, we should be talking about how we can increase the political participation and economic and social inclusion of Afro-Brazilians who have been murdered and marginalized throughout Brazil's history. And let's shine a light on the historic land grabs and religious persecutions that these communities have continued to face. So instead, this hearing is about protecting Brazil's democracy, but really, it's actually an attempt to undermine it by interfering in Brazil's judicial process and giving a platform to the very individuals who spread lies about Brazil's election. Not only that, the far right in the United States is using the debate around Brazil's fight against disinformation as an opportunity to cry victim when they face accountability for their own anti-democratic actions and to give themselves cover for their enabling of the January 6th insurrection. So if that is not the definition of gaslighting, I don't know what is. I just have a few questions. They're yes or no questions. Mr. Figueiredo, did I pronounce it correctly? All right, apologies. Yes or no? Is it true that you are currently under investigation by the Brazilian Federal Police for your role in the January 8th coup attempt?
I don't know. I haven't received the proper
Thank you,
notice.
moving on, reclaiming. Is it true that an official report from the federal police provides evidence of your participation in a group created to, quote, discredit the electoral process, plan the execution of a coup d'etat, and abolish the democratic rule of law?
Same answer.
You don't know, okay. Do you disavow the military dictatorship that ruled Brazil from 1979 to 1985?
This has nothing to do with what we're
Okay,
discussing
yes
here.
or no, please?
This has nothing to do with what
Yes
we're
or
discussing.
no? Reclaim, I can ask, this is my hearing.
I can
Yes
answer-
or no?
With all due
First
respect,
Amendment
I would
rights,
hope
I
that
can
there
answer
would be respect
whatever I
shown
want.
to the witness, too.
Moving on.
With all due respect for the witness and vice versa.
Mr. Chair, vice versa. Mr. Shellenberger, yes or no? Is it true that you have repeatedly published false information that defamed public figures who are dedicated to combating disinformation?
No.
Including, okay, thank you for that response. Mr. De Silva, I have some remaining questions for you. Can you talk about information that was coming out regarding the January 8th attempted coup and what can be done to make sure that accurate information is shared for Brazilians and for the global community? I think respecting, protecting, strengthening democracy is incredibly important. And I do also agree that we have a real problem with the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation.
Thanks, Congresswoman. I think, is it a yes or no
It
question?
is not a
ma'am?
yes or no question.
Order, please.
Can you repeat the question, Congresswoman?
Yes. To what extent, if at all, did the events of January 8th pose a threat to Brazil's democracy and constitute an attempted coup d'etat? And what are the implications of the attempts to manipulate and deny the nature of the January 8th attack?
I believe we still need to wait for a few months until the investigations are finalized. But recently, as I noted in response to Congresswoman Wild, there has been substantial evidence that there was a plot to stage a coup, that this plot started with the discrediting of the electoral process to seed, among the people, the idea that the elections were going to be defrauded beforehand. And then after the elections took place, there was the idea was to create chaos so that the military could take over based on that sketchy interpretation of Article 142 of the Constitution. So that's the plot that emerges from those documents. I think when it comes to cross-national discussions of domestic political issues, there's always a gap of information that needs to be filled. So a lot of what's happening in Brazil doesn't seem to come across clearly to U.S. authorities as well as the general public. So, for instance, I guess the premise of this conversation has been that Mr. Moraes has taken down social media posts and profiles from the Brazilian right. When I actually demonstrate on page 5 of my testimony that, first of all, it's not just Justice Moraes, right? It's 2 courts involved in this with many justices. And second, that many of these posts and profiles taken down also are from people from the left. And last week, actually, President Lula was fined for a speech that he gave back in the campaign by the TSE, the Electoral Superior Court, which is presided over by Mr. Moraes. So how can one say that there is a collusion between Mr. Moraes and President Lula when the court that Mr. Moraes presides has just fined President Lula for a speech that he gave back in the elections, right? But all these details, it's difficult to convey them because they relate to so specific things. And the same is true for law, right? I believe that I'm the only person in this room that has a Brazilian law degree.
You're not.
And yet, there's a lot of people who want to, interrogate aspects of our criminal procedure in a hearing in the U.S. Congress. I mean, with what information, right? And honestly, with what authority? I think, I believe it's important to have cross-country conversations about domestic political issues, but these need to be more well-informed sometimes. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, we don't have times.
We don't use them in
Okay.
this subcommittee.
I have one more question. What is your assessment of the ways in which, and this is for Mr. De Silva, what is your assessment of the ways in which Brazil's judicial institutions and Congress responded to the events of January 8th?
Initially, in the very aftermath of the event, there was great union in the country, not only among the 3 government branches, but even among governors. I believe I was reading, a lot of times it was mentioned here, articles by Jack Nickas from the New York Times. He has written critically about the Brazilian Supreme Court, but he also wrote an article praising Brazil for the way it responded to the January 8 attacks, where there was great union in the country as opposed to the United States. There were investigative proceedings that took place in Congress about this, which produced a very important report that I think needs to go on record. And the Brazilian judiciary is responding through these investigations that we've been mentioning, as well as directly because about 1,000 people were arrested in the buildings, and they're being tried right now as we speak. Some of them are being convicted, for different penalties according to their involvement in the events. I guess about half of them have been given plea deals by which they are not going to even be prosecuted, which to me indicates that the court is trying to sort out who needs to be held really accountable for engaging in violent acts and who had a more ancillary role. So, I think the institutions are responding as they are supposed to do. I mean, this is not an easy situation for any country to navigate, right? And the Brazilian democracy is very young. It's only about, 35 years old. People talk here about censorship and censoring speech of journalists. This is what happened to journalists in the military regime in Brazil. Mr. Herzog was suicided in prisons for trying to critique the regime. There's nothing that's vaguely similar to what happened back then happening right now. Thank you.
Thank you, and I would just add, I was also there when the arrests were made for the alleged assassination of the Councilwoman Marielle DeFranco. And so as we talk about people being able to speak up and speak out and not be afraid for their lives, I just want to bring her back into this fold. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no further questions.
Mr. Castro.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you all guys for your testimony today. I am the Ranking Member on the subcommittee that oversees the Western Hemisphere and the United States' relationship with our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. And also as somebody of Mexican descent, very concerned about democracy in the Western Hemisphere. And I think the truth is that over the years, leaders on both the left and the right have abused their people at times. And have abused their countries at times. Unfortunately, I think over the years, the United States' inclination was to call people on the left dictators and leaders on the right allies when that happened. We need to apply the same standards to everyone, whether they're on the left or the right, and make sure they don't abuse their people, that they respect democracy, and that that the people get to determine who their leaders are. That should be our only interest. Our interest is not in picking who Brazil elects as their leaders. That's the choice for the Brazilian people. And so, to the extent that y'all have relayed serious concerns about what's going on in Brazil, then we should look at those and we should have conversations with the Brazilians. I think that is fair. But I also want to be clear that these issues didn't start on January 8th of 2023. There were some very deep issues with President Bolsonaro, and I'm sure with presidents, perhaps on both sides before that. And so I wanted to ask you, Mr. de Sá Silva, I'm sorry, I apologize if I mispronounced your name, but what are some of the issues? Because we need some context here, right? The world didn't start in Brazil 2 years ago. So what was going on before that with President Bolsonaro?
You mean before President Bolsonaro?
Well, during that term, well, here, give us, we have a few minutes. I promise I won't go too long, but look.
Oh, I actually teach in, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you said that democracy is only 35 years old. Kind of the evolution of that and how we get here. Look, y'all know that in Latin America, there were disappearances in different parts of Latin America. There are families that still don't know what happened to their kids, right? So getting democracy in Latin America right is very important. Respect for human rights is very important. So how do we get to where we are in Brazil?
Thank you, Congressman. I actually teach an entire course about Brazil from 1988 to 2018 to my students, and it's very interesting because the first 2/3 of the course, I guide them through a process that was very positive for the country of consolidating democratic institutions, democratic practices, and harvesting the fruits that come from this process. In 1988, we had our Constitution. Next year, we had our first election. We had President Collor, who served for a few years. He was impeached. There was maybe a hiccup in the process. But after that, Itamar Franco took over as rose as the president. Brazil adopted the Real Plan, which stabilized currency. That was very important. It had a very important effect in reducing poverty and in giving people predictability. Cardoso had 2 terms, and then Lula was elected. It was a beautiful scene to see Cardoso passing the sash to Lula, right? A university professor from São Paulo passing a sash onto a metal worker. This shows that rotation occurs in power. And then we had President Dilma Rousseff. She made some mistakes, especially in economic policy, right? But then, after 2013, 2014, the country has been through a turmoil, which deepened or really caused political polarization. And I believe at this point, the Brazilian history converges somehow with the history of the US and many of the democracies that are under stress right now, because we have all these factors: polarization, extremism, the role of social media in help to spread misinformation, right? And really producing a political culture that's antagonistic to democracy and to the rule of law. I hope that gives you some sense.
And I wanted to ask y'all, we had in our own country January 6th of 2021, which has been described as an insurrection. I think that it was a kind of attempted coup. In Brazil, you had January 8th, 2023. Where is Brazil in holding people accountable, the people that were directly involved in that attack?
There are several key differences. The first one is that you can claim that January 6th was an insurrection. You can claim that, but because President Trump was in power. But in Brazil, Lula was the president already, had been for 8 days on January 8th. So I don't think we had an insurrection, because what would be the outcome of the insurrection? Let's say on January 6th.
But we've seen in Latin America and around the world, leaders can get overthrown by insurrections and coups.
But Lula wasn't even there. No one was there. It was a Sunday. So it was definitely a riot that went out of control.
But if you overtake the building and you don't let government operate
I
and
agree
so
with
forth.
You. I was the first one. I was working on the largest TV network at the moment. I asked to join in and get on air, and I was the first one on air saying these people were stupid from doing what they were doing and they should go back home.
So you think they should be held accountable?
I think they should be held accountable by the crimes they committed individually, meaning if they desecrated public patrimony, yes, definitely. Let's hold them accountable. But they were not attempting a coup d'etat. There was no way, that was not possible. You cannot commit there's a law professor here. You cannot commit a crime if the crime is impossible. Right. That's a principle in the law.
Yeah, okay, so we disagree on that, but I get it. But let me ask one more question, because y'all have had a long hearing as subcommittees go, all right? On the question of Rumble, the Brazilian government, in September 2021, then President Bolsonaro attempted to ban social media companies from removing certain content. And under that policy, social media companies would not be able to remove any content unless it pertained to nudity, drugs, and violence, or if they encourage specific crimes. And so here you've been making the case that the current Brazilian government shouldn't call Rumble and say, hey, take down this specific post or so forth, right? Well, but the reverse of that is, do you believe that a government should be able to make such rules, or do you believe that a private company, private entity like a social media company, should be able to remove content from their platform? In other words, if you go back under Bolsonaro, was President Bolsonaro right to tell social media companies, hey, you can't take anything down except XYZ?
With respect to Rumble, Brazil has no jurisdiction on anything on Rumble whatsoever. We do not have employees there. We do not operate there. We're a U.S. company with offices in Canada as well. Brazil has zero jurisdiction to make any sort of claim to remove anybody off of our
So
platform.
your position is that Bolsonaro is wrong and Lula is wrong?
My position is that if we don't operate in that nation, they have no jurisdiction whatsoever to ask us to remove anything from our platform. Rumble operates under the laws of the United States, which is the First Amendment, and we believe, and we all believe in this room, that freedom of expression is a human right, which is also Article 19 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So when someone asks to remove a political creator or a non-political creator that doesn't violate the terms of service of any platform, I'm fully opposed to that.
Well, no, and I just want us to be consistent, right? Because the point that I've made is that under the left and the right, you've had presidents who get heavy-handed, right? And like I said, we should take a look and talk to the Brazilians if they are infringing on different free speech issues. But this has happened repeatedly in different ways with people in different parts of the political spectrum. And we have to be mindful of that as well. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Castro, for those comments, because I do believe that this is a pivot point, and I think we need to be making a very clear statement to Lula and to the Supreme Court that it is intolerable to violate freedom of expression, freedom of speech. You know, Lula himself compared the Israelis to it's like when Hitler decided to kill the Jews. I abhor that comment that Lula made. Reuters reported it. But it's a free speech. He has an opportunity to say it. And you know, I don't agree with it, but he has the right to say it. And I would say equally, people who disagree with the Lula government or with the Supreme Court should have an unfettered ability to speak out without facing potential criminal charges, without being deplatformed. And to that, I would like to just ask Christopher Pavlovski, what kind of Rumble creators were targeted for orders? You know, who were they focusing on?
So we've received multiple orders from the Brazilian Supreme Court, and they range from various different creators, some political, some journalists, some, I would say, just that talk about anything. The very first order that did come to Rumble to remove, and we had multiple orders on this individual specifically, was a person by the name of Monarch, who, as my understanding, is like the Joe Rogan of Brazil and has no real political affiliation or is, you know, identifies with any political side at all. And that was the first order that we received to remove.
Ms. Wild?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Figueiredo, close enough?
Good job.
I have a few simple questions, would appreciate simple answers, and I know the chairman would like to get us out of here by noon, so maybe we can expedite this. Can we agree, you and I, that the 1964 to 1985 military government was an anti-democratic regime responsible for killing hundreds of political opponents?
It depends. You can't compare what was happening in 1968, as the professor here can better explain, to what was happening, for example, in 1979. When my grandfather was president, for example, he already got in power with the AI-5, which was a very undemocratic act. It was not in place anymore. First thing that he did was to give amnesty to political prisoners. We had free speech. We had the Supreme Court working. I'm trying to answer your question.
So you disagree that the military government was an anti-democratic regime?
Well, it's a nuanced answer, like I just said. Part of it, yes. Part of it, no.
Okay. Do you agree that they killed hundreds of political opponents?
Some of them, yes, and some of them in the guerrilla as well.
Okay.
But I don't think that's the purpose of what we're talking about here. This is not a hearing about the history of Brazil. It's about what's happening now.
Okay, so let's move on. Do you believe that the 2022 elections, and by the way, history does dictate what a democracy looks like, as I noted in my opening remarks. So history is very, very relevant.
Yeah.
Do you believe, sir, that the 2022 elections were in fact free and fair?
I do not.
Do you believe that the Brazilian armed forces then should have acted to support President Bolsonaro's draft decree?
Who? I'm sorry?
Do you believe that the Brazilian armed forces should have acted to overturn the 2022 election results?
I do not.
Okay, so even though you don't believe them to have been fair and free, you don't believe that the armed forces, you believe they properly acted in not acting to overturn those results?
Madam Congresswoman, are you familiar with the report of the military on the elections of Brazil?
I am, yes, but
So what do you think they should have done
no.
when they
I get
realized
to
that
ask the
Brazilian
questions.
elections
It's a
was?
simple, do you believe that the armed forces acted appropriately?
I do not.
And let me just read a few statements by former President Bolsonaro, and let's just see if we can agree or disagree on this. These are quotes. Elections won't change anything in this country. It will only change on the day that we break out in civil war here and do the job that the military regime did not do, killing 30,000. If some innocent people die, that's fine. In every war, innocent people die. Agree or disagree with that statement?
That statement is from 1994, and I completely disagree with it. And
You're
I think
very
President
familiar with the statement. Yes, he made it as a member of Congress, but then years
Yes.
later as a presidential candidate.
So I
he
disagree.
He refused to disavow that statement. So you agree or disagree
I
with that?
completely disagree with that statement.
Okay. And then he went on to say, I have three alternatives for my future: being arrested, killed, or victory. Do you agree or disagree with that statement at the time that he made it?
Well, I think he has a very high chance of being arrested, but I disagree with his statement as well.
And do you see that as an acknowledgement that he might lose the 2022 election, his statement?
I think he expressed his distrust on the electoral system since the beginning.
In 2018, then presidential candidate Bolsonaro called Colonel Ustra a national hero. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I don't have enough information to answer that question.
Okay. And in office, he reinstated commemorations of the 1964 military coup and openly celebrated the military dictatorship. Agree or disagree with that?
Agree.
Action? Thank you.
It was a counter coup against a communist coup. So, yes, we did not want a communist to be part of Brazil as it was in Cuba and other countries. But I do not agree with the route that several leaders in Brazil took for many, many years. And I come from a family that has been fighting for democracy for a long time, and that's the legacy of my grandfather, restoring full democracy in Brazil. So I'm very supportive of that.
I appreciate your family's efforts at restoring democracy and upholding democracy. And just because you have pointed out earlier on one of my particular interests, I wanted to bring to your attention public remarks that I'm sure you have heard the former president say attacking the LGBTQ community. One example being that he stated he could never love any of his children if they were gay. Do you find such comments harmful to marginalized communities in Brazil and ultimately to a Brazilian democracy?
Well, I don't agree with these remarks, but I'm not here to defend President Bolsonaro. I'm here to defend free speech.
Okay, I'm not asking you to. My question is,
with all due respect,
let me
this
finish
is
my
not
question.
a inquisition of
But it's a hearing
former
about
president.
democracy, and I just want to know whether the witness believes that those kinds of statements are supportive of a democracy.
I don't think they're nice statements,
I
but
don't
I
think
think they're
the
protected.
witness needs to answer that. I think we've veered so far away from the purpose of this. I mean, I could talk about skepticism for elections. In my first election, 2,000 dead people voted against me. It was engineered by the Democrats in the city of Trenton. When I tried to get the officials to look into it, and we verified it had happened, they would not do it. We got the verification that it happened, but there was no effort to hold people to account. Okay, you just move on. There is a healthy skepticism that we should all have. Matter of fact, my opponent went into court to keep the city of Trenton open beyond the time limit because it was raining out, And the fear was some people might not be able to make it to the polls. They were going to count how many people they needed in order to defeat me. Now, I learned from it. I became friends with a lot of people. The county clerk told us, do you ever wonder why you never got the A ballot position? Because they used to refrigerate the ball. He would put his hand in, pull out the A position, and the Democrats would get the A position each and every year. And a similar type of effort was lodged against me with people who were dead voting. That said, I still believe in the system. I still believe that we need to have a healthy skepticism. I have a healthy skepticism. You know, I voted to ensure that Biden was made the president during the Electoral College. Why? Because we could not prove, or the administration could not prove that it had been falsified. But there was all kinds of mistakes made, and I also had to look back at my own experience, but you got to be able to prove it. But that said, you move on. This hearing is not a relitigation of January 6th or January 8th, despite some efforts to cloud over this issue of freedom of expression being violated with impunity. So we're going to keep a focus on that. Lulu does not have a right, nor does the Supreme Court justice in Brazil, to violate people's free speech rights, which are universally recognized. And as you pointed out, Mr. Schlesinger, in your statement, the Constitution couldn't be clearer. That's what this is about. So any other thought, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Really is a distraction in a very real way. Again, so I would ask, and I am going to honestly continue pushing very hard to ensure that free speech rights, which are universally recognized, are recognized by Brazil. Hearing's adjourned.
Let the record reflect that the chairman has cut off the ranking member in contravention of our usual tradition of not doing so.
Well, with all respect, we reconvene. Make your final statement.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You have to give me one moment because I closed my binder here. And thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I do want to address what I consider to be the harmful impact of oligarchs on a democracy. And in particular, there's been a great deal of defense in this hearing today of Mr. Musk and his platform. And I think it's very important that we understand his ideological agenda. We're talking about somebody, and I'm referring to Mr. Musk, who not only does not believe in labor unions and who here in the United States has attempted to stop workers at his company from organizing, but he's also challenged the constitutionality of the National Labor Relations Board in court. So that gives you an idea of just how much Mr. Musk values people's rights. And I think that it's important that we understand the impact on democracy of oligarchs like Mr. Musk, who act as if their wealth and their power places them above the law and provides them with some sort of global mandate to destabilize democracies around the world, including Brazil and right here in the United States. He and his allies and our witnesses and the chairman claim not to have an ideological agenda apart from defending freedom of expression, but let's face it, they have a pattern of going after progressive, democratically elected governments which prioritize issues such as workers' rights and national sovereignty over natural resources. So while they frame their actions in the context of freedom of expression, I think that it would be accurate to say that freedom of expression is threatened by the unregulated flow of false information. With that, I yield.
Did you mean me?
Pardon me?
You talking about me?
I was talking about the witnesses.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank our distinguished witnesses for their testimonies. I hope that the people of Brazil will look at this, and be encouraged that there are people in Congress, not all perhaps, but there are people who strongly believe that they have a right to freedom of speech. That is a hallowed right, it's a God-given right, and it should not be circumscribed for political agendas. So I want to thank you. You know, Elon Musk, whether I'm pro-labor, I'm a pro-labor union guy. That said, if he has a position against labor unions, he's entitled to it. I disagree with him. I have a bill in that's going to pass soon, hopefully on the floor. It passed out of the Ways and Means Committee on cobalt. Cobalt is being extracted from the DR Congo through child labor, and unfortunately, cobalt is a mainstay of the electric vehicles, and unless that supply chain can be cleaned, because it is going into his cars as well, we've got a real problem there, because nobody should drive a car that was built on the backs of dead children in DR Congo, and we're talking about 25 to 40,000 kids, 200,000 adults, all in forced labor. That said, Elon Musk has been a refreshing and I think a very important voice about freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And I laud him for it. I thank him for it. And I'm so glad that he's taking such a principled stand in Brazil as well as around the world. Hearing is adjourned.